Yeah, that's a great summary. And it really fits in well with today. It gives me a great segue to talk about the next thing. So thanks, Sydney. So did y'all watch that video on liberalism that was required today? It talked it talked about Hobbes, right? So Hobbes is this interesting figure because on one hand, he's kind of considered like a grandfather of liberalism, but on the other hand, he's sort of a realist. So yeah, Hobbes is an interesting character that's like kind of both of those. It's kind of in both of those worlds. I'd explain more, but we can talk about it later. Let's start with going back to these questions, from how many people answered the first one? Oh, great. Okay. What did the author mean when they wrote much of the discourse around liberalism is either autopsy on one hand or demonology on the other? Reagan.
For each of the two ways, can we talk about liberalism today?
Yeah, what did, when, like, more specific?
So autopsies explain why liberalism failed.
Yeah.
And then demonologies explain the problems of society.
Right, that's a great way to put it. How did other people phrase it? Yeah, Ryan.
I included that, but then also I mentioned to just talk about how I believe most of them are kind of post-liberal or criticizing liberal just because we have our current liberal world order that they can draw evidence from negatively to support a demonology article or an autopsy article.
Yeah. So autopsy just is trying to describe why it died. Right? So kind of assuming that it's died, it's not the thing anymore. And then demonology is like kind of just all the things that's wrong with it, or it's to blame for all the world's problems. Yeah, Michael.
That was actually what I was going to say. That pretty much, I didn't write this down, but just was that demonology in the sense that it kind of is responsible for the current day problems that we're facing.
Why didn't you write that down?
Because I knew what to say. I
Trust
just
yourself.
didn't write it down.
Okay, trust yourselves. Y'all understand more than you think. I think sometimes students get like a little, oh, I'm not sure. Write it down. That would have been a right answer. That was good. What were some other answers? Somebody else who answered this question? Was it very similar to what they're saying? Yeah, Brandon.
Basically said that, but I also added knowledge. They said it was things like inequality, inflation, corruption, and all of that.
Yeah,
So, well,
yeah, that was good. Yeah, excellent. Anybody else? Colin.
I referenced kind of the roots of demonology and how they derive from England, essentially, where King Ferdinand dubbed individuals who abjured his authority.
That's a great detail. Yeah. Yeah, I meant to that was stuff like that. I wanted to point out to you, I was being here's an interesting detail that may jump out at you and may make its way into your notes, and that's great. The hard part is sometimes we think that that's a main point, and it's not. It's usually an example of whatever it's an example of. That's the main point. So I'm really glad you brought that up. That's great. Anyone else on the autopsy versus demonology? How many of you have heard, does that, the autopsy part, those were all great answers about the demonology part, but the autopsy part, does that make sense? How many of you have heard some of the discussion that's been happening in the past few years about the death of liberalism or the death of the liberal world order? You've heard of it a bit? Yeah, good. Yeah, because it's been going on for, I guess, the past few years. I got really interested in it too. I read, I think for me, the book that kicked it off was in 2015 by this guy by the name of Patrick Deneen. He's a professor at Notre Dame, and he wrote The Death of Liberalism book. And then this book is kind of a response to that. There's been many books since then. And so all these IR scholars are talking about, is liberalism dying? And if it is, why is it dying? So that's the question. I mean, some people say it's not dying. I would say maybe it's not dying. For other reasons, I can tell you later, but that's the debate. Is it dying or is it not dying? And then if it is dying, why is it dying? So yeah, those were some of the debates that are going on. So that's the autopsy part, and the demonology part. Here are all the things that's wrong with liberalism, which is perfectly fine. There are certainly valid critiques of liberalism that are really important, right? So what about the second one? How many of y'all answered the second question? Oh, really? Few? I thought more people would answer this one. So it's what, 4 or 5? That's it? Okay, what did y'all put for the second question? What did the author say that Tocqueville meant when he said, there's a lack of guarantee. When Tocqueville said there's a lack of guarantee against tyranny in America, what did the author say that he meant by that? All the time.
Lack of refugee, like the place to protect certain individual from the power of the government.
Perfect, perfectly said, yeah. A lack of protection against the power, well, not only of the government, but of tyranny in general. Yeah, that was great. Was it Devin?
So, along with that, I also said that like, there's, in America, like the majority can like suppress the minority and they're also like their individual freedoms and all that.
Yeah.
And there's no real checks from the government.
What page did y'all find this on? Did anybody happen to write down page number? This would have been a good one because it was 5 or 7, I think it was. It's a good thing because it's a specific thing that you could quote in your in-class essay, for example. But yeah, that was good.
Wasn't it like the War of 1812 where like the newspapers, they got like attacked because of a majority and they didn't get any punishment or any like, accountability because of the majority was okay with this. So it's like,
Yeah, is that something you put down in your notes? And
that was like the,
Yeah.
that was, yeah.
yeah, exactly. All these were good answers. Any others? I was surprised. I thought more people would answer the second one because there was like kind of a very specific note about it earlier on, but I'm glad so many people answered the first one, and it sounds like y'all, got it mostly right. You understood the beginning. So here I was worried that y'all would be like, oh no, got it. You probably have it more than you think. This always happens. You get kind of like nervous, like, oh, I didn't really understand it. But often you actually understood it more than you think you understood it. Let's go back and remind ourselves what we're talking about when we say, is liberalism dying? What's the death of the liberal world order? What was the liberal world order? We talked about it a little bit in class. It starts off at this period. Before Michael.
Yes, that were most of the nations in response to Holocaust from Nazi Germany, as well as the oppression from the Soviet Union that were basically bound to like, we're not going to be.
Right, that was good. You brought up both because it's this next slide. And by the way, I just wanted to put this. When we say post-war, usually we mean post-Second World War. It's been lots of wars. But when we say the post-war period, we're always referring to this period after the end of the Second World War, 1945. And what happened right after the Second World War ended? You mentioned it, the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so
The Cold War. Exactly. So both of those things. So this era, the post-war era, was defined by all these institutions, these international institutions that the US and its allies created after the war, right? So that's the UN, NATO, the WTO, what would become eventually the WTO. They didn't call it that back then, but eventually it became this big organization that regulates trade, the World Health Organization, et cetera, et cetera. Like these are the international institutions that define what we call the liberal world order, also known sometimes as the liberal international order, and it's abbreviated as the LEO. So has anyone heard that term, the LEO, before? Not talking about horoscopes, but the LEO as in liberal international order. So yeah, so there was this belief in that era, like Michael said, it was like they were responding to the horrors of World War II. And there was this belief that, poverty and extremism are connected. Poverty and extremism and war are connected. So this is why the US had the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after the war. It wasn't just because like, oh, we're bleeding heart liberals and we just like to give money away. No, there was a specific reason why they wanted to have the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And it was, they thought that would help prevent another world war. They also wanted to prevent countries from allying themselves with the USSR. In the US wanted to help prevent countries like somebody was talking about Greece and Turkey, right? So Greece and Turkey after the war were in a financial crisis. And so the US wanted to keep them from falling under the sway of the USSR. So they had to give them a bunch of financial aid. Well, think about after World War II, everybody's, exhausted from war. Taxes were really high during the war, of course, because war is expensive. So everybody's looking forward to a big break in taxes. Now you're gonna tell them, well, we need to give money to these other people over there. How are you gonna do that? Isn't that hard? You can see why that would be hard, right?
This is also why the Vietnam area.
Hold on. So you see why that would be hard to tell a whole country like who's exhausted from war. They're exhausted from paying high taxes. They're looking forward to a tax break. They want their taxes to go down. And you, the government, that, you know, you have to say, well, actually, the Truman administration says, well, actually, we got to give a bunch of money to these other countries over there. How are you going to sell that idea? Because you have to sell an idea. You have to tell people why. So they told people why. The Cold War, basically. You have to scare people. You have to scare people, you know, into understanding why we need to keep countries from falling under the influence of the USSR. Does that make sense? So basically, there was a quote where somebody, you know, and they're talking in the administration, you know, Congress was against this too. So somebody says, you know, like, how are you going to get them to approve this? And the answer was like, well, basically, you have to scare the bejesus out of them. So, scary. Soviet Union. I mean, you have to switch. They went from being, you know, old Uncle Joe, Stalin, right? An ally, that to switch to being an enemy. Like that. So, in a sense, yeah, it's messaging. It's a communications campaign, otherwise known as Abraham propaganda. Yeah, you had a comment?
I was wondering if Russia did anything similar to the Marshall Plan.
Oh, did they? That's a good question. Not that I know of. They weren't as economically strong as we were after the war. But you know, they did have sort of similar things. They had ComIntern and ComInfo. These were two. ComIntern was to try to go into other countries to support communist parties beginning in other countries. And the other country where that happened significantly was, of course, China, right? So the Chinese Communist Party gets started with the direct help from Russia. ComInfo was kind of like their external propaganda arm. So they had sort of similar things of kind of propaganda and outreach, but as far as specific international, like just aid just for development, economic development specifically, I can't think of anything that's comparable to the Marshall Plan, except for more recently. How many people have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative? There you go. 1, 2, Colin. Anybody else? 3, Colin. So what's the Belt and Road Initiative? What country is doing that?
China is, it's like for third world countries, they just put a lot of money into like help infrastructure rebuilding. And then their goal is for them to slowly slip away from America and closer to China.
Yes, that's really important. So are they doing it because they're a bunch of bleeding heart liberals in China? Why are they doing it?
To get more like influence in those regions.
Yeah, the same reason the US did the Marshall Plan. Because that's how, what we talked about last week, hegemony. That's how a country becomes a hegemonic leader. It builds a world order. You build a network of influence, and that's part of it. Questions? Does that make sense, Michael?
Well, China also.
Yes, it makes sense, right? So, yeah, so that's the liberal international order. So basically, the US built it. And yes, we're talking about dismantling it now. We won't go into that. Y'all draw your own conclusions. Does it make any sense? I don't know. It's the world order that we built. And now it looks like we're wanting to undo it. And so here's my my short version. There are lots of valid criticisms of liberalism and of the liberal international order. But if it goes away, what would replace it? How does a world order get built? What did we talk about last week? How does a world order get built? Who builds it? Who builds world orders? Weak countries or great powers? Who are the second and third most powerful countries after the US?
China, Russia.
China and Russia. So who would build a world order if the one that we built is no longer there?
Probably throughout.
China.
Trying to throw Asia and Russia throughout Eastern Europe.
Yeah, but short version is, if the liberal world order doesn't exist, then you have a world order built by the second or third most powerful countries, so China or Russia. Yeah, Kevin.
Does it have to be individual countries though? Because Russia's influence has waned, and it could be argued that the European Union could be up there as a formidable player on the world stage.
Could be. That's a good point. I would hope it would be them because they're more liberal democracies. And I'd rather live in a liberal world order than a world order led by China or Russia. But yeah. But anyway, so that's the liberal world order, right? And I'm getting to the article for today. One of the founding documents of the liberal world order, the Atlantic Charter. This was when FDR and Churchill met on a ship in the Atlantic and worked out, these are our war aims, these are our goals. And their goals were specifically in opposition to Hitler's goals. So Hitler said Germany needs more living room or, expansionist. The Atlantic Charter said, well, the Allies, we specifically respect the right to self-determination. So we're not expansionist. So the Atlantic Charter becomes the basis for the UN Charter. And then there was also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So these three documents become like the founding documents of the liberal world order, right? I'll post these slides later, so don't worry about writing any of this down. But that's, we've seen this before, the definition of liberal world order. Any questions so far? This makes sense so far, right? Questions about hegemony or who builds world orders or why weak countries don't build world orders? Dylan, did you have a question or thoughts or anything?
No.
Okay, so we've heard this before about liberalism, key themes of liberalism, old white guys who identified as liberals, right? This is Descartes, Locke, and I think, is that Rousseau?
Montesquieu?
I think it's probably Rousseau, but Montesquieu would be up there too. So just some examples. You probably already know this from high school, the Enlightenment, right? Emphasis, this is the traditional view of liberalism. This is going to come up in the article. One of the key points that the author of the article questions is this one here. But I'll explain that. So anyway, do these look familiar? Key ideas of liberalism, emphasis on individual rights or on individualism, emphasis on freedom, liberty, reason over superstition or religion. That's where Hobbes comes in and why Hobbes is considered one of the fathers of liberalism, because he goes and said, instead of saying that a sovereign should rule based on divine right, he says a sovereign should rule based on reason. And the reason why he says that is because in an anarchical world, Hobbes lived during the English Civil War, right? Literally, your neighbor could come in and chop off your head in the middle of the night. This is the world that he was living in. Very, very, very stressful place to be. So that's anarchy. He says, if that's your alternative, it makes logical sense, reasonable sense, that for a logical reason, why you would want to give power to a sovereign, a king, a monarch, in order to rule, because that's better than living in this anarchy. So that's a justification for rule based on reason, not based on divine right. That's where Hobbes is a liberal. Where Hobbes is a realist is that view of anarchy. What kind of anarchy does that sound like? We talked about it last couple of weeks. Who thinks anarchy means stuff like Hobbes described? What was last week's main theme? Sorry. Okay.
Was it realism?
Yes, realism. Yeah, so that's why Hobbes is a realist. So he's a liberal because he believed in a rejection of the divine right to rule and rule justified by reason alone. But he's a liberal, he's a realist in the sense that his idea of anarchy is he has a very negative view of human nature, right? If there is no rule, then what you have is utter chaos and anarchy. Your neighbor can come chop off your head in the middle of the night. Nobody to stop them from doing so, right? So that's why he's he's got one foot in both worlds. Make sense? Okay, so let's talk about this guy a little bit more. John Locke right here. Because this guy is makes a point that the author of the article this week expands upon. So how many of you have heard this idea that John Locke influenced Thomas Jefferson, particularly the writing of the Constitution, right? He has this idea of limited government. You've heard this before from your American government classes or something. So Hobbes, when he made his argument that there's no reason to believe in the divine right of kings, that there's a logical reason why we should allow a sovereign to rule, Hobbes made monarchy absolute sovereignty to that monarch, no rights, nothing liberal at all about it. The monarch had absolute power. So Locke comes along and says, well, hold on. I grant you that that logical reason for why you would have a government because of anarchy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that government needs to have absolute power. You should have limited government. There should be protections, right? So that's Locke's main contribution, is that it's not that the government has unlimited rights to rule. However, there are natural rights, what they called natural rights back then, and individual rights. Humans have a natural right to liberty, stuff like that. So when that government begins to rule tyrannically, then it loses its right to govern, and then people are justified in having a revolution. You see why this influenced the founders of the US? Makes sense? So his big contribution is the protection of minority rights. Government is obliged to protect minorities. Government can't just do whatever. There are limitations on that rule. But he does agree with Hobbes that anarchy means that there's a reasonable, logical explanation for why government should exist. That there's no divine right. So that's why I say he's a reaction to Hobbes, who justified absolute rule of the king, because that's better than the state of nature, which is anarchy, right? So that brings us finally to this article, Liberalism as Refuge. This is a really recent article. This was just published last year in this journal called the Journal of Democracy. So this goes back to this theme I have been hitting on for the past few months about how to analyze an argument and how to read an academic article or a book. The very first step that you want to do whenever you're encountering any academic article or book in any subject whatsoever, not just political science, is ask, what is the problem that the author is addressing? What is the question that they're trying to provide an answer for? So this is something you should probably write down. I mean, this will be in their slides, but that's the very first thing. What is the problem the author is, or the issue the author is addressing? What's the question that they're going to want to provide an answer for? These things are always really early on in the article. It's known as the research question. So in every academic article, in every academic book, the very first part is going to be telling you about some problem. This is a problem. This is an issue. And they may spend several paragraphs on it. Sometimes if it's a book, they may spend the entire first chapter describing this is a problem, right? So that's the very first thing. And then they're going to say what their answer is to that problem in their thesis statement. So take a look at the second paragraph of the article. Let me pull this up here so we can. Does anybody have that up? Second paragraph of the article. Have a good description of the problem. Okay, whoops, yeah, let's see. The problem that, say this is the first page, so second paragraph would be, in times of liberal dominance, such as after Soviet Union fell, below 1989, so critics, today would be welcome, but today, however, we run the risk of overcorrecting. So that's a hint that he's starting to describe a problem. There's a problem, he's saying, with we're overcorrecting or believing too much in liberalism. So if you read this paragraph, you can kind of see how he's describing the problem that he's going to address. Right? So he is frustrated by injustices that seem to flourish in some of the spaces of liberal pluralism. What does that word pluralism mean? Anybody remember, Michael?
I guess. More than one.
More than one, yeah.
Like a religious pluralism is basically freedom of religion, you know, you
Exactly.
have to be a, you speak, to be agree with else.
Yeah, perfect. So pluralism is the idea that there's more than one legitimate point of view. There's more than one voice. Not everybody has the same opinion. They don't have the same interests. They don't have the same goals, right? The idea of pluralism is the idea that society is made up of multiple people, multiple different interest groups. Has anybody taken the political parties and interest groups? That's with Dr. Tauber, yeah. So multiple interest groups within society, as opposed to like populism, which says the people all want one thing. So the idea of pluralism is that you may have like the business community who have things that they want, and that may be different from the community of farm workers who want a different thing. And that may be different from the community of police officers and teachers who want slightly different things, and lawyers who want other things. All of these groups have to coexist within society, and they're all legitimate. Right? So that's the idea of pluralism. So you can see how early on he's describing the problem here. And at the end of this paragraph, he says, here, I offer one way of understanding that motivating spirit of liberalism and why we might admire it. So he's told you what he's going to do, why he's writing the article. So that's the sort of thing you want to look for when you're reading an academic article is what's the issue or the problem that they're addressing? And then what's their answer? They're going to tell you, here's what I'm going to do in this article. In this case, he's going to describe a way of thinking about liberalism. Does that make sense so far? Yeah, Michael.
Could you go slow up a little bit more?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw a little bit of these sentences before your highlight. In this context, many of us have lost track of the motivating spirit of liberal societies, and perhaps even more than we have forgotten what we can be internet. And I think part of the way he's getting at is we are growing tired of liberalism, but in a way where it's more like we've forgotten why liberalism is so great compared to any other form of government.
Right, yeah, that's what he's saying. That's his diagnosis of the problem. Somebody else may not see that as a problem and they're not going to write the article, but for his argument, he's saying that's the problem. And I'm going to provide an answer to it. My answer is here's a new way of thinking about liberalism that we haven't yet considered. So it's a new idea, a new approach to defining liberalism that he's going to offer here. And I'm saying it kind of builds off of what John Locke was saying about protections, that idea of refuge. You know, like what is a refuge? What's a wildlife refuge? Yeah, sanctuary. It's a place you can go to escape something. Right. So we'll come back to that idea a little bit. We see the very beginnings of the article is like the most important point. Look at this right here. He even italicizes it. Liberal societies, I want to suggest, are those that offer refuge from the very people they empower. So who's empowered to rule, whoever that is, there needs to be some protection from those people at some point. And if you read down a little bit more, you can see this example. This was helpful. Monarchy, for example, is only a liberal monarchy when it also includes parliament or something or some other people other than the king or queen or whatever. You also have some kind of power. You have a liberal monarchy, like the UK, for example. Without that, then you have absolute rule by that monarch, right? So a monarchy can be liberal if it also has some other group besides the king or queen who has power. Does that make sense? So that's what he's talking about. That's the refuge from that absolute power of the monarch. This is in the parliament, for example. So read down here, like here's another example. Analogously, democracy empowers the people, or more precisely, the particular people who can persuasively claim to speak for the majority, but it's only a liberal democracy if it also offers refuge from those same leaders and partisans. So, for example, I think I may have mentioned this before, but why did the ancient Greeks never talk about democracy? Reason, why did the ancient Greeks, how come Socrates never talks about democracy? Plato's never thinking about democracy, even though Athens was a democracy, they don't use that word. Anybody remember why? What word they often used instead?
Yeah.
No, the reason is, I don't think I actually mentioned it, so no. The reason is the word democracy was pejorative up until the 19th century. What does pejorative mean?
It's like a negative connotation.
Yeah, negative connotation. Yeah, so it's like democracy meant mob rule. It meant like rule by the masses. So remember we're talking about Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. He describes the situation that happens in Athens democracy during the war, where the assembly meets and they decide we're going to send a ship to this island to kill all the people. It's not Melos, it's some other island, but we're going to, send a ship over to this island to, this is voted on in the assembly, right? It's democratic decision making. 24 hours later, everybody sleeps on it. And they wake up in the morning and somebody gets up at the assembly and says, that's such a great idea. Maybe we should reconsider. So they talk about it, some other people get up and say, yeah, I think that's right. I think we should reconsider. So they vote then to send a second ship after the first ship to tell them, stop, wait, don't kill everybody. We think that's not such a good idea. That's how the ancient Greeks saw, some of the problems of Athenian democracy. It's unpredictable. It's very much ruled by the passions, right? A persuasive speaker can convince everybody to vote in a certain way, but somebody else may convince them to vote in another way the next day. So the word democracy had negative connotation up until very recently. That's why Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers of the US, they don't talk about democracies. They say instead what? No, they say another word that starts with an R. Republic. Yeah, that's why the Republican Party is called Republican Party, right? Because republic is just, another name for a modern democracy. So they used the word republic instead of the word democracy. Okay, so what was my point there? Anybody follow? What was my point? Yeah, remind me.
Why didn't they call it, what did the Greek city-states, why did they not call it democracy?
Yeah, why was I telling you that? Because,
It's essentially,
okay, yeah, it was because,
there were no safeguards in the form of government they had at the time, though.
why they were saying democracy, a liberal democracy, why democracy meant mob rule. And a liberal democracy has protections against those things. So remember how Viktor Orban in Hungary, he talks about how Hungary is now an illiberal democracy because they still have elections, but they don't have any other protections against the rights of minority, for example. It's majority rule. There's no protections for a minority. If you're not in the majority, then yeah, you're just out of luck. That's right. So that's the liberal part of liberal democracies, is that there are some protections. Does that make sense? You see how this is getting to where the author is talking about liberalism as refuge, refuge being protections. Right? This is a lot I'm throwing at you so far. Yeah.
I mean, an example would be, say, if a person was to win the presidency, not in the United States, mind you, just in general.
Okay.
A liberal safeguard would essentially be that because this guy won, you're not allowed to go around and harass your political opponents.
Okay, yeah, okay. Well, let's just take the US as an example of liberal democracy. Do we give absolute power to the president? Or did we
Checks and
before?
balances.
Right, checks and balances. So that's the liberal part. There's supposed to be 3 branches of government, not just one. Right? So that's what he's talking about. The liberal. Let me go back to my slides here. See how I was going to. Yeah, the authors. Okay, so yeah, what's the answer? The author's answer to the question, looking on page 137 is right there, italicized. Now notice how the rest of the article is going to develop the author's main idea, their answer to the question in more detail. Just exactly like you're gonna do on your in-class essay, right? That's their thesis statement. The rest of the essay should develop that in more detail. So I've showed you this before, right? The five steps to analyzing or evaluating an argument. So that's the first one, is to identify what's the research question, what's the author's answer. And we talked about number 2 here, right? Identifying the assumptions. And we talked about number 3, identifying the key propositions, or also thinking of, identifying the key concepts, right, AJ? Key concepts, right? Key propositions. The other thing you want to look at is that type of evidence. What type of evidence do they use to back up those propositions? And finally, we'll talk about the implications of the argument. We're not going to talk about these yet. Let's focus on this third one, because that's the most important, right? For any argument, the most important is, what are your propositions? A plus B equals C. If A is wrong, then your whole argument doesn't hold water, right? If B is wrong, then A plus B cannot equal C. If the logical connection between A and B is invalid, A is right, A is correct, B is correct, but maybe A plus B does not equal C, they equal F or C. You see, remember those things? So the most important part is to identify the key concepts and the key propositions of the argument. So if we're going to start out with the propositions of this argument, where are we going to start to look? What are some of the key concepts? Start thinking there. Think about a key concept. What's a key concept in this article? Michael?
I guess liberalism. Better.
As an argument, let's say, make it even more basic. What's a key? Just one concept. Look at the title of the article of a book. Often that'll offer you a clue. Ryan?
Liberalism provides refuge.
Yeah, but you can make it even more simple. Like, think of a key concept could just be one word or 2 words, like a phrase. It doesn't have to be a full sentence. Say that sentence again without saying it as a sentence. Say those words.
Liberalism and refuge.
Yes, 2 key concepts, the concept of liberalism and the concept of refuge. So we know these are 2 key concepts. If you don't know what liberalism is there's the thing, right? So the first step in identifying the propositions is to identify what those key concepts are. Refuge especially is, of course, like a main key concept here. So we said refuge equals safe harbor, protection from abuses, right? Look at page 138. And he says liberalism, he goes on about this. He's going to clarify this concept of refuge over the next several, what is this, 15 pages? The next 14 pages, because he says this on I think the second or something. He's going to spend 14 pages clarifying what he means by refuge. There's a whole section. Remember, looking at the subsections, write down the titles of those subsections in your notes, because that will be helpful. What's the title of, did anybody write them down? What's the title of some of those subsections? It has to do, well, you maybe didn't even finish, because it's fine if you did not early on. Yeah, great.
Some of the sections.
Okay, what's that? Let's start first one. Refuge as remedy. Yeah, exactly. What was the second one?
Lower governance
Mhm.
and where's the refuge?
Oh, here it says refuge. So right there you have 2 hints about how he's narrowing down that concept of refuge. Refuge as remedy. That section is going to develop a specific part of that key concept in more detail. Refuge as remedy. And then the section on commerce is going to develop a very specific idea about how commerce is both a refuge and something that we need refuge from. Let me end on that note, because that was maybe the trickiest part, I think, of the article. Really trying to look at that section of the article where it talks about commerce, refuge as commerce. You got that? There's also this choice and temptation. You can look at this later. And then the nobility. So you can look at these. I'll post these on the slides. But going back to refuge as commerce. In this section, there's 2 takeaways. Well, that's actually me. There's two takeaways. One is that commerce is, okay, so he gives an example. Whenever somebody's giving an example, that's a good clue that it's a key point. So in there, there's an example of the Jews in medieval Christian Europe, right? Very, like, they're the only ones that were allowed to handle banking because it was seen as unclean, right? So the Jewish people are the only ones who can be involved in the banking industry. So commerce becomes a refuge for the Jews from the oppression of the political power. And he talks about the letters of exchange. Does anybody know what that means, what those are? Letter of exchange just means that, you know, you can go to another country, another political entity, and have a means of getting credit or wealth in that other country. So all your rubles being in the Bank of Russia are not stuck there. You can go to France and have a letter of exchange and get your money. So do you see how this provides an escape hatch? That's the key concept, refuge as escape
They were able
hatch.
to leave the country, but they were able to maintain their wealth and that.
Exactly. So that's the first key point of that difficult section of the article. Commerce itself can be a refuge. If you have money, you can, if you have enough of it, and maybe substantial, you can escape political persecution in many cases, right? Refugees who fleeing by political violence often don't have money. Right? That's why refugees often go to the nearest country next door, because these are very, very poor. If you have money, you have more options, right? This makes sense. The second key point of that difficult section, commerce as refuge, is also very important. So don't overlook this. Commerce itself can be something that we need refuge from. Think about Elon Musk. He has an awful lot of money, and now he has an awful lot of political power. You might feel like you might want a little protection from somebody like Elon Musk. Maybe. Maybe. If you're in his good graces, okay. But what if you're like one of the many people he doesn't like? You're going to be targeted. Do you need some place to get away from that? Do you need an escape hatch? Liberalism, that's what he means by liberalism, offering escape hatches. So commerce, the ability to make money can be an escape hatch, but people having so much money can also be people that we need the escape hatch to escape from. Both sides.
An example, I remember purchased Twitter or renamed it X,
Yeah,
putting in
yeah.
different policies. And a lot of people were